Зачем?
Belarus, a country caught between two giants in the heart of Europe.
A country trapped in the heart of Europe, forever caught between giants. For decades it has survived under Alexander Lukashenko's iron grip, clinging to Moscow's shadow for protection. But today, that fragile balance has been smashed apart. Belarus is no longer just squeezed between East and West, it is being crushed inside a merciless steel vice, tightening from both the South and the West at the same time. Ukrainian drones strike like ghosts in the night. They glide silently over the skies, seeking out the Druzhba oil pipeline, the very artery that keeps the Belarusian economy alive. Fires erupt, one after another, until the pipeline burns 3 times. And from the west, another pressure bolt slams shut. Poland, enraged after Russian drones violated its airspace, seals every border crossing. Overnight, Belarus is cut off from Europe, its last link to the outside world. Severed, this double squeeze is more than an economic blockade. It is the spark of a storm inside Belarus itself, a storm that now pits Lukashenko's regime against his own people. And somewhere behind this chaos, watching calmly, perhaps even orchestrating it, stands Vladimir Putin. For his war, he does not hesitate to throw his last loyal ally into the flames. The abyss has opened under Belarus, and the anger rising in Minsk streets is beginning to reshape not just the country, but the entire fate of Eastern Europe. It all began when Ukraine changed its war strategy. Kyiv stopped fighting only at the front and started attacking the weak points that fuel Moscow and its allies their economic lifelines. For Belarus, that lifeline had one name: the Druzhba pipeline. Built in Soviet times, this vast network delivered Russian oil to Belarus's giant refineries, Mizir and Novopolutsk. These refineries fed the country's fuel needs and brought in billions of dollars from exports. But when Ukrainian kamikaze drones struck one pumping station after another, went up in flames, NASA satellites captured the infernos raging for days. The effect was immediate. Oil flow slowed, then stopped. Refineries cut production, gas stations filled with endless lines, farmers had no diesel, factories ground to a halt. The regime's most vital source of foreign currency vanished overnight. Leaving an economy already crippled by sanctions gasping for air, Moscow responded by siphoning fuel out of Belarus to cover its own shortages. This was no ally rushing to help. It was a drowning empire stealing the last lifeboats from a sinking ship. And while the South bled Belarus dry, the West delivered a deadlier blow. Poland's decision to close its border didn't just stop people, it froze the arteries of trade. Overnight, China's Belt and Road shipments through Belarus collapsed. Trains carrying billions in goods were stranded. Lukashenko's dream of turning Belarus into a Eurasian gateway crumbled in an instant. The border closure was a logistical nightmare, but also a political disaster. Thousands of Belarusians with families, studies, or jobs in Europe were suddenly trapped at home. Whatever legitimacy Lukashenko still clung to collapsed in the eyes of his own citizens. And what if Putin, the man Lukashenko depends on for survival? He not only abandoned his ally, he engineered the crisis. The drone provocations that pushed Poland to close its border. They weren't Belarusian, they were Russian. Moscow used Belarus as a shield, sacrificing it for a strategic test. Ukraine's drone strikes on the pipeline, a direct result of Putin's war. Russia drained Belarus of its resources while closing every door to the West. This is not alliance, it is exploitation for Putin. Lukashenko is nothing but a tool. And when a tool becomes dangerous or useless, you discard it. And so, Belarus burns. The anger of 2020 returns to Minsk streets. But this time, the chants are different. The signs no longer just say, Lukashenko. Out they read, "This is not our war." And louder still, Putin, get out of our country. This is no longer just protest. It is a national awakening. From Brest to Grodno, entire cities rise. Fuel shortages, empty shelves, a collapsing economy. Millions of Belarusians have nothing left to lose. And within the regime itself, the cracks spread deeper than ever before. The police, the army, the intelligence services, the very pillars of Lukashenko's survival are wavering. When soldiers can't fuel their own cars, when officers lose access to bank accounts and privileges abroad, loyalty begins to erode. The dictator's greatest fear is not the crowds outside his palace, It is the moment when he gives the order to Firand, a commander dares to say, no, the future of Belarus now hangs on three dark scenarios. 1. A democratic revolution, sweeping Lukashenko away and pulling Belarus toward Europe. 2. A palace coup, where his own generals depose him to save themselves. Or 3. The nightmare Russian intervention and civil war. Trigger a geopolitical earthquake. Putin would lose his buffer. NATO's frontier would press closer to Moscow. The war itself could turn ending far sooner than anyone imagined, with Ukraine victorious. For Lukashenko and Putin, time is running out. The steel vice is closing, the people are rising, and the silent rebellion inside the regime grows stronger every day. This is not just the story of one dictator's downfall. It may be the beginning of the end of a war. Asterisk, instead of limiting itself to grinding battles on the front lines, that lifeline had only one, named Ruzhba, built in Soviet times, stretching thousands of kilometers. This pipeline was the main artery carrying Russian oil into Belarusian refineries at Mizar and Novopolitsk. These facilities didn't just fuel Belarus. They exported refined products to Europe, bringing billions of dollars in hard currency that Lukashenko used to keep his fragile economy afloat. But then came August. Ukrainian kamikaze drones slipped past air defenses and struck one pumping station after another. Fires raged for days, visible even in NASA's satellite images. What Ukraine had targeted was not just steel and oil, it was the oil stopped flowing. Refineries cut production. Gas stations filled with endless queues. Farmers could not plow their fields. Factories shut down production lines. The Belarusian economy, already strangled by Western sanctions, instead of helping, Russia began siphoning fuel out of Belarus to cover its own shortages. This was not a brotherly hand, it was an empire stripping its vassal of the last resources it had left, while the South bled Belarus dry. The West delivered a strike just as devastating. Citing drone violations of its airspace, closed the border. But this was far more than a political gesture. The move severed Belarus from Europe completely. Trains packed with containers ground to a halt. Trade collapsed overnight. The biggest blow landed on Lukashenko's bet on China's Belt and Road Initiative. For years, he had sold Belarus as a bridge between East and West, a corridor for China's goods to Europe. But with Poland sealing its crossings, that corridor was dead. Billions in trade lost. Trains stranded. Beijing suddenly saw Belarus not as a partner, but as a liability, and for ordinary Belarusians, the human cost was devastating. Tens of thousands of citizens who studied, worked, or had families in Europe suddenly found themselves trapped. It was a cruel reminder. Their country had become a prison. Minsk's Independence Square, once the epicenter of mass protests in 2020, now echoed with new chants. This time, it was not just Lukashenko. Out of Belarus, what began as anger at shortages and economic collapse was transforming into something more powerful, a national awakening. And yet, in the face of this crisis, Putin remained silent, or perhaps deliberately silent, because it was his actions that had set the stage for this disaster. The drone incursions that triggered Poland's closure, launched by Moscow, not Minsk, Ukraine's strikes on Druzhba, a consequence of Putin's war. Russia's siphoning of Belarus's oil, a decision made in the Kremlin. For Putin, Lukashenko was never a partner, and when tools break, you discard them. But now the real danger to Lukashenko lies not only in the streets, but within his own walls. For 26 years, his survival rested on absolute loyalty from the security forces, the KGB, the Oman Riot Police, the army generals. He rewarded them with privileges, money, and immunity. But the double squeeze has broken this pact. An Oman commander in Brest, forced to crush protests while unable to find fuel for his own car. A KGB colonel in Minsk, suddenly cut off from his bank accounts and children's studies in Europe. The system that guaranteed loyalty has collapsed. And loyalty. It is the moment when he orders his security forces to Firand. They refuse. That is how regimes fall. Quietly, then all at once. So what comes next for Belarus? Analysts see three paths. The first, a democratic revolution. The protests grow, cracks widen, and the regime collapses. Exiled opposition leaders return. Political prisoners are freed. Belarus turns westward, beginning a historic shift toward Europe. The second, a palace coup. The other bolt, squeezing Belarus, closes in from the west, from the Polish border, following the violation of its airspace by Russian drones. Warsaw has sealed all border crossings with Belarus indefinitely, cutting off the country's last lifeline to Europe. This double blow is seen not only as an economic blockade on Belarus, but also as the fuse for an internal turmoil that pits the Lukashenko regime against its own people, the citizens of Belarus, in a deadly confrontation. And behind the scenes of this game, there is a figure who is calmly watching all this chaos unfold, perhaps even orchestrating it: Vladimir Putin, the puppet master, who, for the sake of his own war, does not hesitate to throw his last and most loyal ally into the fire. This double squeeze has brought Belarus to the brink of an abyss, while the wave of anger that began in the streets of Minsk has begun to completely change the fate of Eastern Europe and the course of the war in Ukraine. Now is the time to step into this ring of fire and decipher the realities behind Putin's betrayal, Lukashenko's panic, and the Belarusian people's uprising. It all began with Ukraine changing its war strategy. Kiev decided to take the war to Russia's and its allies' most vulnerable points, their economic lifelines, rather than just fighting on the front lines. For Belarus, this lifeline had only one name: the Druzhba oil pipeline. This massive pipeline network dating back to the Soviet era was the main artery, carrying Russian oil to giant refineries in Belarus, such as Myzyr and Novopolotsk. These refineries not only met Belarus's own fuel needs, but also earned the Lukashenko regime billions of dollars in foreign currency by selling processed petroleum products to Europe and Russia. Ukrainian kamikaze drones carried out surgical precision operations targeting this artery. The main pumping stations in the Bansky region were targeted one after another. Thermal images captured by NASA satellites showed the world massive fires raging for days at one of Druzhba's largest stations. With this move, Ukraine was striking not just a pipeline, but the entire economic model of a regime. The effects of these attacks were immediate and devastating. Russian oil flow first slowed, then came to a complete halt. Refineries in Myzyr and Novopolotsk were forced to cut production because they could not find crude oil to process. This instantly triggered a fuel crisis. Within Belarus, kilometer-long queues began to form at gas stations across the country. Belarusian farmers couldn't find diesel to plow their fields, while factories slowed down their production lines. But the real blow was to the regime's coffers. When the vital flow of foreign currency from petroleum product exports suddenly stopped, the Belarusian economy, already crippled by sanctions, was immediately placed on life support. International agencies reported that Russia, realizing the scale of the crisis, began urgently withdrawing gasoline from Belarus, despite its own domestic market problems. This was not an ally helping another, but a scramble to salvage the last lifeboats from a sinking ship. While the Belarusian economy was being shaken by these UAV strikes from the south, a much more deadly and lasting blow came from the west: Poland's closure of its borders, although this decision was presented as retaliation. For Russian drones violating Polish and Romanian airspace via Belarus, its effects were much deeper and more strategic. The closure of the border completely cut Belarus off from Europe geographically. This meant not only restricting people's freedom of movement, but also halting all of Belarus's trade with the West overnight. In particular, trade with China, on which Lukashenko had pinned great hopes in recent years, was effectively severed by this decision. A large portion of the €25 billion worth of goods shipped annually by rail to Europe under China's One Belt, One Road project passed through this Poland-Belarus route. With the closure of the border, freight trains carrying thousands of containers were stranded in Belarus. This was not only a logistical nightmare, but also a major financial and strategic blow to Beijing. Lukashenko had suddenly become an unreliable and problematic partner to China, one of his most important economic partners. The humanitarian drama unfolding at the border completely destroyed the regime's legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. Tens of thousands of Belarusians working, studying, and having families in Europe were suddenly trapped in their own country. This situation completely severed the already fragile bond between the regime and the people, which had been fractured since the mass protests of 2020. So, in the midst of this crisis, what was Vladimir Putin, Lukashenko's biggest ally and the one who ensured his survival, doing? The answer to this question reveals the darkest and most ruthless aspect of the crisis in Belarus.